Hello, this is Zach from United Healthcare. That's really awkward. That's my main job. Really awkward. Okay. Anyways, this is what your pastor did tell you. Today, I am talking with someone who's written a number of articles on the Coconino Sandstone. And many people might be like, what in the world is that? So, this is a type of basically like a rock that lots of people have used to argue for a global flood and partially related to a young Earth. So this is really interesting. There's a lot of interesting questions, things that maybe scientists don't know the answer to. We'll find out today. How are you doing?
Doing great. Nice,
Awesome, and
nice fall day.
I appreciate it. So your name is Tim Helble, and you've written a number of different articles on this topic. You've written a book with Carol Hill and Greg Davidson on this, related to this topic at least. But for those that are not aware of this whole discussion, what is the Coconino Sandstone?
What is Coconino? It's a really cool looking sandstone in the Grand Canyon and northern Arizona that is just below the rim of the Grand Canyon. And it's made pretty much of pure sand. There's some other constituents in it, but it stands out because since it's made with pretty much all sand, it forms a real steep cliff. And if a piece of rock breaks off, it pretty much the whole face breaks off.
Hmm.
So it's steep, and you don't get much vegetation on it because of that. There's a little bit of vegetation, and it stands out from the rim. When you're looking at the canyon, you see this big white bathtub ring that just goes across the there you go across the canyon. Everywhere you look, you see this white or buff colored
Oh, okay.
there you go, sort of strip just below the rim. And it's interesting because it's so different from the other layers
Hmm.
because it's so steep. Uh, the like I said, there's no vegetation on it. The other layers are more stair step like and have a lot of trees growing on each stair step and stuff, so they look
Hmm.
darker or whatever. But the coconino just stands out, and that's what makes it interesting. And
Hmm.
its beds are just different from the other formations too. They're much they're steep. They have a lot of steep crossbeds in them. Other formations have crossbeds too, but the coconino is pretty much all crossbeds. So
Hmm.
uh,
Interesting. Okay. So you mentioned the word crossbed. We're gonna have to do this a lot just to make sure we're gonna really dumb this conversation down to make it so it's easily understandable for someone like me, and that'll be really difficult. So that's gonna be a challenge for you, Doctor
yeah,
Helble. You are a doctor, correct?
no, I'm not a doctor. I just have
Not
math.
doctor. Okay.
I just have
Master's.
science.
Okay. Awesome. Interesting. Okay. All right. Anyway, so um, yeah. So we're looking at the screen here. It's literally like you can go to the Grand Canyon, and it's pretty easily seen if you know what you're looking for, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, you can see it in the picture here. It's just that little whitish layer of rock, and it's pretty near the top. And you mentioned what was the word you used?
crossbed.
Uh, what was it?
The constituents that it's made of, or you're talking about the crossbeds.
Crossbed. What is a crossbed? Yeah.
Well, like you look at the lower right there, that inset picture, and if you look at it up close, you can see some lines. I guess it's the right term. I don't know if you can use the word line. You see some slanted lines in there, some slanted beds, and you see some that are pretty horizontal. So those are cross beds, and they vary in angle quite a bit. Some are perfectly flat, and some are
Hmm.
a little bit over 30 degrees, and it represents some interesting things going on in the past.
Hmm. So
And we'll get
like you
more.
have just like these different angles of rocks like going against each other, basically.
Yeah, yeah. If you ever go to a sand dune on a windy day, you see a lot of sand blowing around, and you'll see in some places sand just if it's really windy, like 30 miles an hour maybe or more, you'll see sand just blowing all over the
Yeah.
place. And
Yes.
then
So when you say sand dune, you mean literally like in the desert sand dune.
yeah, really, the consensus view is that these were the Coconino started out as mega dunes, which is an interesting term. It's not just a mound of sand, but it's kind of like a mound of sand moving on top of other mounds of sand, if that makes any sense. And so you can have a dune form or a dune advancing over an already existing dune. They're so
Huh.
big. And
Y-
the biggest ones are like 1,500 feet high, and they're in
mhm.
China.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, what you're saying is like the sand, the what like wind pushes the sand, and it goes on top of another dune, and something happens to make it so it makes all these weird different layers.
Yeah, like you see in that picture, there's some pretty steep mountains there. That's in the empty
Uh,
quarter in Saudi Arabia, that left-hand picture there. Um, so you got a real strong wind, and then you'll get smaller dunes migrating or
yeah.
advancing over those mountains, and
Yep.
it's a very slow process.
I see.
I saw the paper about some mega dunes in China, and they did some new dating techniques on them, and the numbers were kind of interesting. The center, the core of this dune was like 50,000 years old. Just it's been there that long. It's just amazing to think about.
Huh. Interesting. All right. That's just a little bit about dunes. Most people don't care about that. So why should people care about this discussion?
Oh, okay, that's a great one. That's a great question. Um, I'll break the why people should care sort of down into two categories. The first thing is we're living in a time when I think that we really need to be listening to what scientists have to say more than ever in our past. There's so many issues we're facing that require us to listen to what scientists are saying. And with the Coconino Sandstone, we have some people that are saying, well, all the scientists that have been researching the
Hmm.
geology of planet Earth for the last 100 years or more are wrong. We've got some inside information that says that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and most of the sedimentary record you're looking at, like in a place in the Grand Canyon,
Hmm.
is or was laid down in a 1 year global flood. And I just think that just is the wrong place to be at a time when so many of the problems we face have solutions that need to be based on science and not on what we want it to be. So
Hmm.
um, that's the first uh, reason I could give. And the second one is that we have a large number of believers that are being told they need to stake their faith on a young Earth and a global flood. And what happens when they find out that they're wrong? Then the danger there is they're going to say, well, obviously this stuff I've been learning in church,
Hmm.
in sermons, and in Bible studies, it must all be wrong, you know. And they're just going to take off and leave the faith. And I've met lots of young people that have done this, and not just young people, old people like me. Um, they just say that I don't want anything to do with this fundamentalism or Christianity, or whatever you call it,
Hmm.
um, because of what because the stuff I was told turned out to be not true. So that's the other danger I see.
Hmm.
I'd really recommend there's a really good video that I recommend people look at, and it's on a YouTube channel called The Sparrow's Call, and it's an interview with a geologist named Jeff Greenberg.
Okay.
And the title of the video is "When Stones Cry: A Geologist Reflects on Faith and Science," and he answers the question a lot better than I just did.
Okay. Yeah, no, I really appreciate this. So you obviously there's a lot of people that really this discussion about science is very important for them because it almost serves as the basis for their being a Christian and living their life. So it's obviously really important to them. Uh, I guess the problem is that if you go into these discussions and of course, this is typical, like, you only listen to one side and you miss things. I've known tons of people that have been like, well, obviously I was lied to, right? That people, they feel lied to, and then they, of course, they decide, like, hey, if you can't trust this part, then you can't trust anything else. And obviously that's not good reasoning there, but when you're in that space of, like, your entire life is changing, it's really difficult to make those types of decisions and stuff like that. So the two things, the reason I want to come on here is, one, because this is interesting, just interesting topic that people talk about a lot, and two, this is a very important for people's faiths and what they're doing. So we got to make sure that we're not giving people the false impression about the facts. What people will be interested to know. So I talked to Dustin Burlett just for briefly at this topic on a past interview, and I'm going to try to get some young Earth creationist scientists on here to talk about this as well after this. So make sure you like and subscribe if you want to know more about this topic. But we're going to be getting into the science there. So let's see, what else do we have on here to talk about? Yeah, so some young Earth creationists, they use this to argue for a global flood. These little rock formations. Could you summarize and present the strongest possible argument for their position? Just like, really quickly, we're going to go through it, but just like the basic arguments, or the strongest ones that they mention usually.
Okay. Well, the first thing I need to bring up there is that nobody has provided an argument for the Coconino being deposited by a global flood.
Okay.
And I'll explain that really quickly. The global flood that most people are being taught about completely reworked the planetary geologic record. And for a place like the Colorado Plateau, that means that over 3 miles of sediment was transported into the Colorado Plateau area in less than a year. And nobody has provided any evidence that the Coconino was deposited at that kind of rate. Nobody's provided evidence that any formation has been deposited at the kind of rates that the global flood calls for. We're talking, like, in the Colorado Plateau, I'll show you some slides later, about 75 feet of sediment every day has to plop down over the whole plateau area to deposit it in less than a year. So anyway, so what they do is they say, let's find evidence for water deposition, for that something was deposited in water, or that water was involved. That's a big difference between that and global flood deposition. So I just want to say that up front. So I'll say that the best argument that I've seen are the ones from Leonard Brand, having to do with trackways in the Coconino.
Okay.
And the reason I feel that is that he figured out how to publish findings that could be used to argue for a global flood in quote secular journals, like there's one he published in called Paleontology, Paleontology, and some other P. What was it? I call it 3P. Anyway, he published articles in these journals and got scientists, other geologists, other paleontologists to comment on them. And he is cited in secular sources. I went to a private museum in California called the Raymond Alf Museum, and his argument is presented on a plaque in the museum. The argument for the footprints being made underwater, and that to me shows that he worked within the system. He knew how to do it, and he did that starting in the late 70s. And back then, most young Earth creationists were complaining that um, they were being censored. They couldn't publish in secular journals.
Mhm.
Brand did it. And at the same time, at that time, the young Earth creationists were basically putting out young Earth arguments like there's not enough salt in the sea and stuff like that. No journals going to publish stuff like that. They need to have solid research-based evidence to publish a paper.
Mhm.
So he did it. So that to me is the best arguments that have been made.
Okay. And we'll get into more because you just like maybe we could start with this one. Probably not a good idea though. But basically, like, so here's one of the slides we have. So like you can see that there's footprints, and basically, what was the argument? Just really quickly, like it had to have water in order for those footprints to be there. Is that basically argument? And therefore, the mainstream position that there was no water, so if there was water there, it makes more sense to say there was a flood. Was that the basic argument? I'm sure it was a little more in depth than that.
Yeah, he was looking at the idea that well, if you look at the bottom photo there, there's the rock in that Alpha Museum that I was talking about, where you see the white arrow, and there's trackways that go up, and then all of a sudden the animal makes a left turn, and another slight left turn, and then it makes a right turn. And he said that those trackways in that middle section, where after he made the left turn, were showing what was going on when an animal was getting washed by a water current, and it was flailing its legs
Oh, interesting.
and trying to resume its direction, but it was being swept off of his feet. So the upper photo there is one that he took of one of his newts. It's a California newt. They're about this long, about 8 inches long. I've caught them and played with them and stuff. And they're very easy to catch. And he put it in a calm water tank. There's no water moving at all. And he got a great photo of some footprints on the bottom there. And he's got a little scale and everything. And he's got a thing that indicates the uphill direction. But that's a calm water tank. There's no water moving. Mm-hmm. So he got the idea, well, let's try to explain how the tracks are made when you've got a zigzag. And so he did another set of experiments with a slight flow of about 0.2 miles per hour, and the water was only 1.5 inches deep. And then he stuck Newt in the tank, and he told it to go that direction. No, he didn't tell it. He put it in the tank and observed and videotaped the Newt moving in the tank. And then he published his results. And in his results, he didn't actually provide any photos of the footprints in the moving water tank. This is the 1991 paper that he did. He just provided drawings with a little sort of a V to indicate the orientation of the foot. Mm. And I wrote to him and asked him, do you have any photos? Do you have any still captures from the video to show what the footprints look like in the flowing water tank? And he said, no, he didn't ever make any still captures. The tapes are lost. And I said, what did the footprints look like? Do you remember what the footprints look like in the flowing water tank? And he couldn't recall how they compared to what you'd seen to Coconino, which is a nice deep impression. So the young Earth creationists sort of picked up on this. Mm-hmm. and said, Dr. Brand showed that the footprints were made in water. Mm. And there's no photos in a moving water tank to show this. And there's no flood flow. This goes back to what I was saying at the start. If water is being, or if sediment is being deposited at 75 vertical feet per day, mm-hmm. you're not going to be able to have newts walking around, or any animal, and leaving leaving tracks. And we can get more into that
Yeah.
back to this. But
Yeah.
anyway, still though, he published and he got other scientists commenting on it. So you got to give a lot of credit for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because that is that's one example of a young Earth creationist. I would assume he is young Earth creationist that is able to publish in the scientific field. So I just yesterday actually I was reading this discussion and I was like, the young Earth creationists they're hated on. They can't publish because people reject them because their main views, not because of the evidence. But you have lots of examples of that. But so that's just one example of one of the arguments some young Earth creationists have used. And so let's kind of really get into just the discussion. So one really interesting question is the dating, and maybe we could talk about the location as well. I'm skipping ahead here. Sorry. So let's get into that. All right.
Go back to the slide. Yeah.
Yeah, back to the slide. So you already talked a little bit about this.
Okay,
Was there anything important on this page here?
Well, I just on the left side, you can see the individual little beds. That's a place where the beds are horizontal, and it's cool because it's on the Grandview Trail, and there's actual places where the wind has blown little tunnels into the Coconino.
Huh.
So that makes that one cool. And then the one on the right there is showing a crossbed on the Grandview Trail, and I didn't put a Brunton on that and measure, but it's a pretty steep one. I would guess that one's like 25 degrees or something like that. It's a pretty steep section, and that trail is really fun to climb on in the winter when there's ice. There's little springs that pop up here and there, and you really got to watch it, or you're going down.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I bet. Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah.
I'm bad with heights, so that's a no-go for me there.
Anyway, yeah. So the next one, we looked at that one on the left. This is in Saudi Arabia. The interesting thing on that one is the water. People assume, especially the young Earth creationists, that water has no role in the desert, but it does. What deserts have water tables. Very, very dry deserts have water tables. And that one's even got some plant life. Now, nobody's found evidence of plant life yet in the Coconino Sandstone, but there's evidence for water in the Coconino in places where the beds are very horizontal, like you would have in that left-hand photo, and in the folds that we talked about earlier. We'll get to that later. But the right-hand one, should I go into that, the history a little bit?
Yeah, if you want to, if it's not too long.
Yeah, okay, try and make this in a minute. The right-hand graphic is showing what the land looked like back when the Coconino was deposited. And the one thing that I noticed right away as a Californian, former Californian, I should say, California didn't exist. Oregon didn't exist. Washington didn't exist. Arizona was shoreline property, and it was tropical. It was down like 5 to 10 degrees north of the equator. And there was a range. This is an interesting part that gets pretty much ignored by young Earth creationists. There was a range of mountains in Colorado called the Ancestral Rocky Mountains. And we know that they existed because there's basins next to where they were that are filled with this angular rock and with other kinds of sediments that were eroded from somewhere. And we know that from just the volume of rocks, of sediment that accumulated in these basins, that the ancestral Rockies probably got up over 10,000 feet high.
Oh, wow.
And they were formed. We're still learning about how and how they formed, what exactly were the sideways pressures in the crust to form these things, mountains. But they didn't last forever. They eventually, during the time shortly after the Coconino was deposited, they were pretty much worn down to just low hills. And the other feature is on the very upper right of that, there were rivers that drained from what were called, I guess I call it the early Appalachian Mountains, and they flowed westward across the country. But there was something that blocked them from getting all the way to the ocean in the west, and it was just like a slight elevation rise. And so they dumped their sediment in huge dry lakes, or not necessarily always dry, but seasonally dry maybe. And the other thing was there was these strong trade winds that blew from that desert. They called it the Western Interior Desert towards the ocean, and it blew lots of stuff towards the Coconino, or where the Coconino was deposited. So you had these dunes that were forming on that little peninsula, and it says Coconino Dune Field there, and surrounded by water on three sides. So that factors in later on when we start talking about land subsidence and sea level rise, what happened after the Coconino was deposited.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I took longer than a minute, but
that's okay.
Yeah, well, that little globe, that little map on the bottom of that map shows what Pangea looked like, and the little box there is where the Coconino was deposited. So.
Interesting. Okay, so just to point things out, so if you look in the picture to the right, you've got these like square shapes, just like that, and on top of each other, that's the state outline of what it is today, and but then the colored portion is like the detailed portion is what it, the proposed mainstream science view of what it looked like back then. And then of course you have the trade winds in the top left, transcontinental rivers in the top right, and then of course you have the mountains in the middle. So yeah, really interesting stuff there of how that kind of changed. That it's just absolutely wild to me that would be something that would even be possible.
Yeah, and those little mountain, not little, the ancestral rock had little streams draining off those mountains, going towards either side. So that's what the blue lines are.
Very interesting. Okay. All right. And well, that was the
that's
the circle. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So now we know where the Coconino Dune Field is. Wow. Good work here so far. All right. So let's talk about the age. So like the mainstream scientific view, how is that figured out?
Okay. The first thing they figured out was back in the start of the 1900s. That's when Lowell and these other guys found these footprints in the Coconino. They were going down the early trails that went into the Grand Canyon, and they spotted these footprints. And they were exchanging their discoveries with other scientists around the world, and other people found very similar or exactly the same footprints in formations in other parts of the world, like in Europe. And they reasoned that they labeled this time at which these animals existed as the Permian. Okay. And that was what's the Permian? It's like 250 to 290. Oh, I forget the numbers now. A million years ago. Anyway, it's a long period of time. And so anyway, they reasoned the Coconino was Permian from these footprints, and they said, okay, now what else do we know? And then later on, in the formation that's underneath the Coconino called the Hermit Formation, they found some plant fossils, and they found a wing of a arthropod that looks like kind of like a dragonfly, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, meganeurid. And then they realized, okay, the Permian's kind of a long period of time. We need to divide it up into ages. And what they do is for different parts of the world, the ages are locally assigned. So they figured out there's an age in the Western United States called Leonardian. And then they realized from other places where they saw the same fossils that the hermit fossils were from the earlier Leonardian. And then they started looking at the overlying formation, the one that's over the Coconino now called the Toroweed Formation. And they found some cool bryozoan fossils, and they were dated around the world. They fit into the late Leonardian category. And I haven't really assigned any dates to that. These dates were just called relative dates, and they're consistent all around the world. You have like the Mississippian period. There's certain kind of fossils that exist that are considered Mississippian that exist all over the world, and they're consistently underneath the Permian fossils. And but we didn't know dates. We didn't know how old the Mississippian is. We didn't know how old the Permian. Nobody had assigned dates yet until radiometric dating came around. And so anyway, you had it sort of bracketed. So you figured that the Coconino is middle Leonardian. And oh yeah, you just brought the there's the it's not a dragonfly. It's like a dragonfly wing. You got the a fern from the hermit, fossil fern. They found 10 species of pine trees in the hermit. So the hermit was a place, a deposit that was being formed by streams washing off of these ancestral Rocky Mountains and other uplifts that were around there. And it was very gradual kind of slopes, and it was very. It took a very long time to lay down the hermit from these streams. Anyway, yeah, there's a diagram in the bottom left shows where the Coconino is, and the Torweep's above that, and the hermit's below it. So, so you go back. Can you go back one slide really quick?
Oh, yep. Sorry about that.
Yeah, just okay. And then they started being able in other places to assign ages for those different ages, if that makes sense. For the Leonardian, there's places where you have some Leonardian fossils and you have some ash that blew out from a volcano. You could date that ash. You don't have that in the Grand Canyon, but in other places you do. So sort of by deduction, they figure, well, if the date for Leonardian is fixed at this other place, then that's the date for Leonardian at the Grand Canyon. But then they came up with a new technique where, yeah, the sandstones are not directly datable with ash layers, but each little particle of sand is datable. You know, not each one, but certain particles in there, and they're called zircons. You could date a zircon in a formation that has sands, and you put it in this apparatus, and you grind it up into powder, like I showed in the lower right there, and you can date the stuff. And so you can come up with like a age spectrum of all the sand in a formation, and that one, the graph in the bottom shows what they got for the Coconino. And then you can figure out, well, where did that sand come from by looking at other places in the country, drilling down to the basement rock, or looking at lavas and stuff, and then you could figure out where that sand came from. And that's how they reasoned that there were these transcontinental rivers. Was you had sands that originated in the Appalachians, they were being washed across the whole country in these big rivers. And then you also had some local uplifts like the ancestral Rockies. You can see in there, there's some peaks on there that indicate that the sand of that age came from a local source. So anyway, okay, I gotta start going faster. So let's see what we can do here. Next slide, then.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, no, skip that one. Then.
All right. So that was. This is where we like kind of get to the arguments, right? So.
Right.
Just for the clarity there. So, a lot of that was just like kind of a little bit over my head. So, back to like these other slides here. So it looks to me like you're saying, hey, you have these layers of rocks, and there's certain different ways to date these layers of rocks. You've got all these different methods, and what you're doing is you're taking a bunch of different unrelated arguments that don't influence each other, and they all come to the same conclusion. So that's how you're dating each level. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, like they dated the Leonardian based on ash deposits in other places, and they came up with the estimated age for the Coconino about 275 million years. There's maybe a little bit of variation on that. There's some new dates coming out that might be 280 or. But then you look at the one thing I forgot to say about that little graph on the lower left.
Okay.
There's a little tiny red bar on the very left side of that, and that represents the actual that 275 million year age for the Coconino. And none of the zircons are younger than that. They just end right there. So the youngest zircons in the Coconino are about 300 million years. So it corroborates the date that they got based on dating the Middle Leonardian and other places of the world, or the other places in the country, I should say, because the ages are sort of a local subdivision of a period. So that stuff's cool. There's a whole database that scientists have developed with this kind of data for the entire world, and they can use it to piece together the geologic history of the planet. There's just amazing discoveries, amazing papers that are being written about this for all over the world. You just like Google detrital zircon geochronology, and there's just all kinds of stuff being discovered. So it's really opened up a trove of data that allows a lot of things to be further refined in terms of the geologic history of the planet.
Yeah. So there was one thing I wanted to show here. This picture here. So you were talking about the different layers, like each of these layers, like you could literally go to the mountains there and you could see each layer, and basically you're saying like, hey, like we can be confident because you've got like 7 different ways to date this one layer, and then you've got like 4 different ways to date this other layer, and therefore like to say otherwise, to make any other argument against that position of these dating would just be really inherently unlikely, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
because all these different layers all these different ways of dating, unrelated, are coming together at the same time.
Correct. Yeah, and the cool thing about those formations is they also have little bits of sandstone in them, so they're able to grind up sand from those, and they get very similar distributions in those formations as you do in the Coconino. So it's not until you get to higher formations that aren't even there at the Grand Canyon that you get younger zircons, younger ages. So
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Let's keep going then. So let's see here.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go way back to get away from that one.
Oh yeah. All right. Let's go back here. All right. So that's the dating there. All right. So James asked an interesting question here. So he says, do you understand the discomfort laymen have when you say you know when it's formed without knowing how? So basically he's like, so there's some questions in this discussion of like, the sand come on top of each other. It's like, these are really weird formations that we maybe you might even say we don't know for sure whether there's an answer for. We might have possibilities, but we don't know exactly how it exactly happened. But he's saying, like, you're saying, hey, this happened like in this time period, and then we could date it to this many million years ago or whatever. But it's like that to some people that maybe aren't as educated on the topic are going to be like, that doesn't make any sense. If you don't even know how it happened, how can you date it?
Right. Yeah. What the geologists do is look for clues in the rock. They study outcrops. They grind up rocks. They look for things in the rock. Like, I don't have any pictures here, but there's places in those formations near the Coconino, not the Coconino itself, but you can see where a stream flowed. You can see a little dip in the in the layers where there was a stream flowing. You look for little pieces of evidence and you try to put it all together and into a coherent, what they call process response model. What does all the evidence say when you put it all together? And so when you say you don't know how it formed, that I understand where that's coming from, but they're piecing together clues to come up with the best current explanation for how it happened. And they keep gathering more data, and if the new data goes against what the old data said, then
Mm.
then they have to refine their process response model. But if it corroborates it, and usually it does, then it strengthens your explanation for how something formed. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my best answer to that.
Okay. So maybe if I could get like a parallel here. So, you know, we usually talk about the Bible on this discuss in this channel. So, like, if you're talking about like an ancient text, so you don't know exactly how that was written. You don't know who wrote it. Uh, there's all kinds of texts that we have no idea about the authorship. Who wrote it? We don't know how, the date or the location. We don't know what they were thinking. Some of the texts just are nonsense. They don't make any sense. So we don't know what the person was thinking when they wrote it. With that being said, you can still date it because there might be other things unrelated to the specific text that say, hey, obviously this couldn't be dated previously this because the language didn't exist or they didn't have this type of paper in that time period. So you could use other ways that are unrelated to actually how the text was written to understand the dating of it. Um, is that? Do you think that'd be like a good parallel there?
Yeah, and you can also like put together clues from within the text, historical references or something, or
Yeah.
uh,
Right.
there's a lot of things that they use to determine things like that.
Mm.
That's my understanding. Theology is tough for me, but because it's not like you can't use equations and stuff to resolve it. It's too frustrating for people like me. So I have to depend on people like you for that.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Uh, so, so let's talk about the charge number one. I guess this is the argument one that you got a whole you've written a number of different articles on this topic, and this is kind of like your summary of the article, right? This is just like one argument that some younger creationists have argued for the global flood. Can you talk about what the argument is and what the discussion's about and explain that to someone that doesn't know what they're talking about?
Yeah. First, I'll just say that the charges that I have in here are mainly from the geologist named John Whitmore at
Okay.
Cedarville University, and he does a lot of talks and stuff, and he lists out these um, myths about the Coconino Sandstone, and so what I'm doing is sort of paralleling that with a few other additions. Um, and I'm sort of converting it into a charge that is being made against the conventional geology view, and then what I do is evaluate what they say, and then uh, try to present the evidence that is out there, and then also try to present inconsistencies in the argument itself. So anyway, this one is we talked about crossbeds already. We have the sand blowing in the air and falling off the back of sand dunes and avalanches and stuff, and it forms beds when doing this. And the technique or I'm thinking of using the word trick using here, or the argument they use is they characterize things like the book, The Grand Canyon Monument to Ancient Earth, as saying that all Coconino crossbeds are near the angle of repose, which is an angle that is determined by when sand can no longer stay at a slope before it falls.
Oh, interesting.
So a slope can build up to about 33 degrees, and then you can't, on a land dune, you can't really build it much higher than that because it'll just tumble down the slope.
I
The
see. Okay.
property is the
Uh,
same. So anyway,
before you go further with that, so just for clarity there, so you're talking about like you have these sand build up and it's a certain angle, and you're saying that once it gets too high of an angle, the sand falls down so that it won't be able to form. Is that
yeah,
correct?
yeah. So they characterize um, what they call what I call critics as saying that all the crossbeds we say that the crossbeds in the Coconino are 33 degrees. They're basically what they're characterizing us as saying. So then they set out to disprove that straw man that they just erected,
Uh-huh.
and so that what they did was, look, they said, let's go out and measure some crossbeds. They got you see the upper right graph there. They found bed angles from like 2 degrees up to 32 degrees, and they got a mean of about 20 degrees. And then they looked at the literature, and they found that marine sand waves typically less than 20 degrees, but sometimes they get up to 30 degrees. And so here's the response. All alien crossbeds are not near 33 degrees. That's just the way dunes are. There's angles all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
What they did recently was admit that very few crossbed dips in the 30s doesn't prove aqueous origin, which is kind of a thing that most people haven't heard. They're still using this argument that the secular geologist said that the Coconino crossbeds are 33, marine sand waves are 20, the average for the Coconino is 20, therefore the Coconino is marine. That's the argument that the laymen are still retaining in their heads, but he now admits that that doesn't prove underwater deposition. And then I just have a few points at the bottom there that Dr. Whitmore said that Grand Canyon Monument to Nature and Earth says that crossbeds are near the angle of repose, and that isn't really what we said. We said that they are either reaching the angle of repose or something like that. We didn't say that they're all near the angle of repose. So we got characterized as saying that they're all near 33 degrees. We knew that they weren't all near 33 degrees. I mean, we've all hiked in the Grand Canyon and knew that there's beds at all kinds of angles. And then there's a movie that came out that I actually saw on the premiere night, is Genesis History, and another flood geologist named Andrew Snelling said that all the crossbeds that Dr. Whitmore measured come in the range of 15 to 25 degrees. And if you look at Dr. Whitmore's graph there, he's got some that are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And he's got some that are at 32. So they're not all between 15 and 25 degrees. So that, and then at the bottom right there, I just have a capture of Dr. Whitmore doing it, showing how you measure a crossbed. And he's doing it the right way. But he's trying to disprove a straw man that was of his own creation. We never said that all the angles in the Coconino are 33 degrees.
Yeah. Okay. So just for some clarity there. So basically, what you're saying is, I guess that for some reason there was this idea that mainstream science believes that the crossbeds are at an angle of 33 degrees, but that doesn't fit with the global flood. So they looked up the angles, and they're like, oh, well, that's obviously not right. And the marine sand waves, when you say marine, you mean like in the water, the sand, like underwater sand, like those angles fit a lot better with what we found, typically less than 20 degrees, sometimes greater than 30 degrees. And that fits a lot better with the actual data, so that disproves the mainstream view. It goes for the water view, because of course that water, that's evidence for a global flood because there's water. But you're like, no, so like those numbers weren't right to begin with. And so would you say this is still evidence at all for there being water, or this just like it doesn't fit with the water view either?
I would say it's you can't go down underwater and dig a trench and look at the crossbeds underwater. It's going to all collapse on you really fast, especially because current, because currents form crossbeds. I'd say it's kind of a neutral thing. You can't really use the angles themselves to argue either way.
Okay, so if it's both data, perfectly fine. So there's no no real reason to use this argument. Okay.
Yeah, they set up a straw man that we never used. We never
Yeah.
said all the beds in the Coconino are 33 degrees.
But then you have the movie Is Genesis History, which had millions and millions of views, and then you have Wetmore, the Grand Canyon Monument to Ancient Earth. What was that? A book that uh, seems to, I guess, misunderstand the argument or the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I've got some drawings later on of the underwater sand waves and stuff. So we'll get to that, hopefully.
All right. This was at the top right. You see the graph. That's Whitmore according to Snelling. So that's what Snelling said, but that's not actually what occurred. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then what do you have here?
And then here, just real quick, those are just some trenches dug into sand dunes, and you can see that the crossbeds in the living sand dune are at all kinds of angles. So that's really all I need to say there. That there's nothing that says a existing sand dune, a modern sand dune, has to have all crossbeds that are at 33 degrees. They're all sorts of different angles. So anyway, go to the next slide then and see what we have here. Okay, now here's what the latest argument is from Dr. Whitmore. He said he went out and compiled data for modern sand dunes, and then he looked at the data for Coconino, his data for the Coconino Sandstone. He got some more crossbeds in the Coconino than are shown in the last graph. He said the distribution's different. Coconino is the blue. It's not just Coconino; it's all sandstones. There's one peak. For modern sandstones, the red, there's two peaks. So that's apples to oranges, I would argue, because modern sand dune has peaks and it's got valleys, and there might be a lot of valley between the peaks, and you measure in the beds all over the place, in the valleys and the peaks, you're going to have two peaks. You're going to have a bimodal distribution. And in the sandstone, everything's been filled in. All the valleys are filled in. You look at the Coconino, it's nice horizontal top, nice bottom, and all the valleys are filled in with stuff that was formed by various dune processes. So you just can't compare a set of data for modern dunes with the Coconino.
And just for some clarity, so why can't you compare them? What's the big difference?
A sandstone is the result of sand processes, sand flow, where all the valleys between the dune peaks are all filled in with something. It's going to be filled in with migrating dunes that are going to be steep angle. It's going to be filled with sand that blew in from the peaks of dunes in real strong winds. So there'll be some shallow angles in there. It's just a different. Once you filled in the valleys, you've got a different animal you're comparing to a modern dune. So
basically what you're saying is that there's different possibilities of the angles. Does that have to do with what you said earlier about the angle of repose? Does the angle of repose change?
No. Now some people argue that compaction lowered the angles a little bit, crossbed angles. I don't think that the compaction of sand is pretty slight percentage-wise, and if you look at the math, it's not going to change the angle of the beds that are inside the dune very much at all, less than a degree. So I'm just saying that a sandstone has is a sand dune with all the valleys filled in, so it's going to be a different distribution from a snapshot of modern dunes.
So what you mean? So you have the sandstone, like the literal, like the sandstone, and that's all the valleys filled in. So that's going to change the angles of what we see. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not going to change the angles. It's going to change the distribution of bed angles, and that's what Dr. Whitmore's graph was looking at. He's just plotting the crossbeds, the angles of the dips. He calls is what it's called. And he's compiling the data for modern dunes. Then he's compiling the data for sandstones, where you go around and measure the dips wherever you can, where you can find a good slab to lay your compass down on and measure.
Okay, all right. And was there anything else here that you wanted to mention?
Oh, just quick. That's just showing a sand avalanche. That's also in Saudi Arabia. So you can see what happens there. the slope is built up to about 33 degrees, and then it just starts falling off.
Okay.
And then the right-hand
cool.
one is in California, my home state, Kelso Dunes, where the wind's blowing at 40 miles an hour, and it just blows the sand up into the air. And then it just settles down in nice shallow angles. Wherever it falls, that's where it forms beds at that angle. So if it falls on a flat area, it's going to form flat beds. Falls on a slope, it's going to form. So you're going to get a lot of different angles of crossbeds. That's called grain fall, whereas the avalanche is called grain flow. So we can advance this slide and look at the next one. Oh yeah, charge 2. Should I just keep going on this?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, this is what I inserted because this is really important. This is not part of what Dr. Whitmore presents, but except in his papers. But what he says in his papers is that ripples in the Coconino could be formed underwater. And ripple is something you see on the surface of a sand dune at a given time when there's a light breeze. You get these ripples that can form. And you can get ripples in water too. So how do you know the difference between a water ripple and a wind ripple? Well, some sedimentologists back in the turn of the last century figured out that you could measure the height of a ripple, and you could measure the distance between each peak. And they came up with this guy named Kindle came up with a ripple index, and he found for some sand dunes around the Great Lakes that this ripple index is greater than 10 to 15 for wind ripples, and then for water ripples it's less than 10 to 15. So basically, you can think about that means that the peaks are really high in water ripples compared to how far apart they are, whereas wind ripples are real low. McKee, Edwin McKee is a famous Grand Canyon geologist, very prolific, very smart guy. Wish I could have met him. He looked at the ripple index for some specimens of Coconino that he found, and he got the 1798 for 21 specimens. So that put all of them solidly in the wind ripple category. And then in one of Dr. Whitmore's papers, to make his argument, he cited this fellow named Helble from a paper Helble did in 1968 to say that ripples in the Coconino. Well, he used Helble to argue that ripples in the Coconino are similar to those on underwater sand waves. But you can find an archive of Helble's paper on a Google site, and you can read the thing, and you never see Helble saying anything about the small scale ripples on the bottom of the ocean that he was studying. He never said anything about the kind of ripples we're talking about here. That's how I would condense it down to a short summary. He didn't have the technology to resolve tiny ripples. He had a side scan radar on a ship, and he's going around the North Sea between England and Scandinavia looking at different sites, and he was using this radar to plot big mounds, big sand waves that are on the scale of hundreds of feet wide. Not that high, but the spacing is very far apart. These huge waves that gradually go up and then have a slope on the other side. The little waves that form on the surface of those giant waves would be the kind of waves we're talking about here. But his side scan radar had no way to resolve those little tiny ripples on the bottom.
Okay, so what you're saying is Whitmore and Garner they cited this scientist Hubelt, and they were basically like, hey, these ripples that Hubelt, I guess, discovered or noted, they match really well with underwater ripples. So that would make more sense with the Coconino than this, typical sand wave. But when you actually look at what they're citing from, like, he didn't even have the instrument to measure that. Is that correct?
He didn't have measurement. He didn't have the instrument to measure small scale ripples on the bottom of the ocean. His depths weren't that great. They're like 100 feet, on the order of 100 feet. But he never went down in scuba gear and looked at the ripples, that kind of stuff. He was looking at side scan radar. So they tried to use Hubble to to say that these ripples in the Coconino
Yeah.
could have formed underwater. But it's using a reference incorrectly.
Okay. And all this stuff, this is in your 2011 paper, right?
No, it's not in the 2011 paper. This is the new one.
Okay.
And
Okay.
now this is all in a presentation on the Evolving Certainties website. And that's longer than what I'm showing here.
Yeah.
But that slab there is cool. That's a Coconino slab. It's in the Minnesota Science Museum.
Mhm.
And if you look at it really close, there's little footprints on it. We'll get to that in a little while.
Okay, cool.
There's a
All
couple of tiny footprints.
Yeah, let's look into that soon.
Yeah.
All right. And so I have the 2011 paper in the description. People can check out that. I'll have to add that later, the new paper. So you can check the references if you really want to fact check him and how he shows it seems like they miscited him here.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the ripples continue.
Yeah.
What about this?
That's just quickly. The left picture is Genesis history movie, and that's just showing some underwater sand waves that they show in the movie, and you can see how they're very high and there's very steep valleys.
Oh, okay. So basically, they're like, hey, these look exactly like over here.
They're trying to use that. Anyway, they actually provided evidence that argues against their case. And the right shows some sand waves on a sand dune in Death Valley that I've climbed up when I was a kid, and it's a very cool place to go after a windstorm. And then the upper right, there's just a diagram that's showing the difference between a wind ripple and a water ripple. The water ripples steeper, tend to be a little bit, tiny bit shorter in wavelength, but mainly the length, the wavelength to the length, to the height. Let's say that again. The wavelength to the height ratio is much less on a water ripple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. And what do you have to say about this one?
Okay, really quick there. Rounding and sorting. This gets an interesting thing that it actually fits on every one of these charges. Some critics, in some kind of popular science book or literature, said that well-rounded and well-sorted sand grains in the Coconino, in the entire Colorado Plateau, for that matter, point to Aeolian origin. So then the flood geologist said, okay, let's slice up some pieces of Coconino Sandstone and look at them up close. And it's called thin section. And it's actually very sophisticated. Takes a lot of patience to put together a thin section. And a guy named Ray Strom was their guy that did these thin sections. It's not like a new technology. It's been around for a long time, but he does it really well. That's all I can say about it. It's good work. So then they looked at these thin sections. They said, okay, the sorting and the grain size is different from modern dunes. They said that the grains are subangular in northern Arizona and they're sub-rounded in central Arizona. So they refuted the critics. They said, look, the critics said they're well-rounded and well-sorted. Our thin section said they're not well-rounded and well-sorted. So they say, okay, the critics are wrong. Therefore, the Coconino bottoms underwater. So.
Right. So just for some clarity there, so well-rounded. So you're talking about like the little pieces of sand. They were just like round little balls, is what the critics said, essentially.
Yeah. Yes. Mostly.
Okay.
Yeah. And the measurements that that they got from Strom's thin sections, Dr. Whitmer looked at, they're not well-rounded. They're much more angular.
Okay, and is that what you see on the top right or the bottom right? Is that what that's showing, or
rounding or the lack of roundings in the upper right there, and then the bottom graph is showing what they call well, that's getting a little bit complicated for this. It would take too long.
Okay,
but they're just
that's
saying it's a thing called sorting, and they're saying that the Coconino, when you look at it, grind up Coconino and look at the sorting, it's different from. It's a little bit different from modern dunes. There's some overlap, but it's a little bit different. So
okay. So just for sorting, that's not like, you're not saying that the rocks are just like all put together real nicely. What does well sorted mean?
Sorting means like it's sort of like the trying to figure out how to say this. The grains, the grains are pretty much all the same size.
Okay.
A given sample.
Okay.
like they're all large or they're all small.
Mm-hmm.
Poorly sorted, I mean, like, everything is just thrown together, small and big.
Mm-hmm.
And the coconino is kind of poorly sorted from what I see. You have
Okay.
more grains in there.
Yeah.
So they refuted the critics, and they weren't really looking at something that a coconino scientist, somebody who researched coconino, said. They're looking at something that a critic said in a book or something, where they're trying to summarize things, and a lot of times the critics overgeneralize the what the actual science was saying, and so
Okay.
they attack the critic rather than just trying to advance science and say, well, this is what we found, and they're trying to use the fact that they refuted the critic to suggest that the coconino was deposited in water. So, but what it turns out, the bottom two bullets there, these researchers found, like Lancaster, he found that roundness in the what I call the 125 micron, 125 to 250 micron range is rare. Most grains are subangular and subrounded. So Lancaster, way back in '95, said that he basically said the same thing that Whitmore is saying now, that the coconino is not it is angular. The grains in the coconino are angular. And McKee, the guy I mentioned earlier, Edwin McKee, he said that inland dunes showed much greater range in mean grain sizes and sorting values than coastal dunes. So McKee already knew that, and had published that sorting on inland dunes is kind of crummy anyway. So,
Interesting.
So Whitmore goes after the critics, and he disproves them, but he hasn't really. I don't think he hasn't contributed anything to the science, because he's just trying to disprove the critic.
Yeah, I see. So basically, the argument is like, hey, so these mainstream scientists, the mainstream view is, hey, they're well-rounded, well-sorted, and I heard this on discussion literally just last night of someone saying this, and then they're like, okay, well, let's look into it under the microscope and see what it actually has, and it's like, oh, well, they're actually not well-rounded and well-sorted. Therefore,
Right.
that's better evidence for a global VUD view than this other mainstream view. But they were only responding to a select people that made those claims, even though they were wrong. There was still, like, other scientists have said that they were round and uh, you know uh, not round, and they had different sizes and different angles, and they weren't well sorted. So just another example of, I guess, them. Well, like, it's like in your case, I'm sure you're like, hey, yeah, you should definitely critique the people that are making false claims, but just you do need to make sure you have a good understanding of all the data, all the arguments in play, all the possibilities, right?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a lesson there. The critics need to make sure that they're keeping up on the latest science when they make a statement about something
Yeah.
like coconino, because they could be just quoting something they read from the '90s, and they may not really be a sedimentologist. They may not be aware of what Lancaster said in 1995. They might not be aware of what McKee said in 1979.
Yeah.
So you make an overgeneralizing statement, then you say, okay, that's a great thing to attack, and then boom.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so there's an interesting question, though, because the argument that I think it was Whitmore that was making that he was saying that the coconino ones, they're neither well-rounded, well-sorted, and normal sand like we have today, like desert sand, it's not like that. So the mainstream view is that it's the coconino ones are more like just normal sand, but what like, even if McKee and Lancaster, if they're okay with Whitmore's view as far as like the size and the shape and all that of the sand, how do you explain how the size and the shape there and the sortedness or not being well sorted, how does that work under a view that says like it's they're similar to desert sand, not related to water?
Well, you may have it wrong there.
Okay.
Lancaster and McKee their findings sync very well with what Whitmore found.
Yeah, right, right.
So,
So
okay,
so how does that make any sense under the mainstream view though?
well, it does make sense with the mainstream view. That's what I'm saying. What Whitmore found um, matches what the sedimentologists know today about modern dunes. Modern dunes are you can't make a one size fits all rule about modern dunes. They're, like Lancaster says, uh, um, roundness roundness in that dominant category, which is the size that the coconino sands are, is rare, and most grains are subangular and subrounded in a modern dune. So so Whitmore was just ratifying what Lancaster said.
So are you saying that like just the normal dunes that we see in the desert today, the desert,
Yeah, yeah,
that they are, they're just like they have all kinds of different sizes. They're not well rounded or well sorted.
yeah. That's what Lancaster is saying, is that you go out in a modern dune, go out in Saudi Arabia, and grab a sample of sand from the dune. It's not going to be there's going to be many cases when it's not rounded, well
Huh.
rounded, and well sorted.
Interesting.
It's cool. It's all right to have that. Now there's cases, Whitmore cites cases where dunes are well rounded and well sorted,
Hmm.
but he's not agreeing with what I saw Lancaster say. Lancaster said that they're they're angular. They're not rounded.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. All right. Was there anything else you wanted to add there?
No, that one went
Okay.
longer than I thought it would, but I don't think there's anything else to
Okay.
say
All
in
right.
there.
What about number 4?
Oh, this is a good one. Um,
Hmm.
Liquefied coconino sands were injected downward into the cracks in the Hermit Formation. Um, Now, what this was really the first paper that Dr. Whitmore published, and he got it published in a secular journal, and it was in 2010. And this was like a year before, excuse me, before my 2011 paper on the coconino. And and what he did was he found these sand injectites at the base of the Coconino Sandstone. Everybody knew they were there for a long time. And you go down the Bright Angel Trail from the canyon rim, and you see these
Hmm.
things on the left. They're pretty spectacular. You
Okay.
got
And what are they? How are they made?
well, we'll get to that in a second here.
Okay.
They're basically sand that was fluidized and injected downward at some point in time into a crack that formed in the underlying strata.
Okay, you can see it in the picture. Like you've
Yeah,
got this layer, and then you've got another layer, and then you've got all this sand that looks like it was like shot out with a squirt bottle or something.
yeah, like a giant squid ball or something under pressure. So what the flood geologists did was they in the paper what Whitmore did was say, okay, there's two possible causes and time frames for when these cracks form.
Okay.
The first option was desiccation, just drying after the hermit was deposited, or the cracks could have formed when earthquakes happened on the Bright Angel Fault in association with what was called a fairly recent event called the Laramide orogeny, and that's when the the rocks you see in the Grand Canyon were uplifted to the elevation that you see them at today.
Hmm.
Uh, so there, he gave two possible causes, and they so Whitmore obviously clearly and thoroughly dissected both those arguments that the cracks forming the cracks by desiccation doesn't make sense. The pattern of these cracks is such that it doesn't match with desiccation.
Uh-huh.
Desiccation is kind of a surface sort of thing. It's not going to form cracks that go way down. And the way these cracks branch, and then sometimes they come back together. They'll branch apart and then come back together. That couldn't be desiccation. So he threw that in the paper. He disproves that argument, and then he says, "Well, how could the coconino, how could the hermit, um, I should say, I'll back up. How could the coconino stay um, unlithified, which means not yet rock, all the way to the point where the Laramide orogeny happened. And in his original paper, he said it was 250 million years later. Now he's kind of rounded it down to 225 because the math didn't quite work out. But how could the Coconino sand stay unlithified for all that time and then be injected when these earthquakes happened in like the 40 million year ago time frame? And so that was pretty easily dismissed too. Just based on the time, it didn't make sense for the Coconino to have to wait that long to become rock. But the thing is, he did not consider a third option, that the Hermit was obviously hard rock when these cracks formed, and it could have happened in a deep time frame, or not could have, but I think it happened in a deep time frame, some point in time after the Hermit had become solid rock, and the Coconino was deposited, but it was still not lithified into rock. But a fairly recent time after the Hermit was formed, after it became rock. But that's still geologically a long time for that for those events, like hundreds of thousands of years maybe after the Hermit had solidified. So and there's a bunch of geology I could go into on that, because there's obviously some kind of time gap between the Hermit and the Coconino, and there's a formation further south that formed on top of the Hermit. And so what basically happened for a long time was the Hermit was sitting there, all the stuff that was deposited from those sediments from the ancestral Rockies sitting there, and the winds were just screaming across the surface of the Hermit, and then they were blowing and depositing the sand in this formation to the south. And who knows how long that was, hundreds of thousands of years. And then, but the sand wasn't able to actually accumulate on top of the Hermit because there's no space for it to accumulate. So eventually the Hermit started to sag or subside, and then there was space for the Coconino sands to accumulate. Anyway, so it then forces on the crust. At some later point, you had these new Coconino sands sitting there on top of a hard Hermit, and the forces were pushing in from the side and buckled the Hermit slightly. And then at some point, the Hermit just went snap. And there was a water table at the top of the Hermit, because it's not a permeable formation. It's silt and clay. The Hermit snapped, and the Coconino's sands just rushed in, filled the crack, and I should say cracks, because it happens all over the place in the Grand Canyon. There's big, huge papers written about sand injectites. It's not something that's not understood. Scientists have been looking at this, and there's even a good paper that's not behind a paywall. You can read all about sand injectites. And this is another one that you're showing there. That one's up in Nova Scotia. That's kind of cool because the sand layer is really thin, and it's going into a shale, and at some point forces cause the shale to buckle upwards a little bit, a crack form, and the sand goes just rushes into the crack. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm kind of starting to see a bit of a pattern here, where it seems to me that you have an argument and it's like, hey, there's only two explanations for this. You, mainstream science, can't explain it with those two explanations. Therefore, must be my view that there had to be water or a global flood involved or something like that.
Yeah.
But of course, I guess the problem with that is, like, we can always find more information or new ideas about how rocks are formed. Like, it's a rock, so like it's almost the possibilities are endless in some ways. Maybe not in this discussion, of course, but like, it's like there's a billion different ways a rock could like change shapes and stuff like that. So I don't know, I guess it's just one of those things, like, yeah, so like I understand the idea of like, hey, it's the best maybe maybe like assuming that your view is wrong, maybe it is the best explanation for like maybe water doing this would be the best explanation for this. Maybe the global flood is the best explanation now, but that doesn't necessarily mean it always be. And there might be other ways we just haven't thought about, or more we don't know about rocks, or in this case, just someone just not considering another plausible way that the rocks form. Um, do you relate to that sentiment at all?
Yeah, that's basically it. What they have to do is rule out the deep time option, the real viable deep time option, and the best way to do that is just not even deal with it. Just skip it
Okay.
over. And you look at the Hermit, actually, this gets into a little bit of a. I'll try to do a quick story. There's a guy named Scott Dunn that came out with a paper. It's actually published in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, CRSQ, last January, and he pointed out that a layer like the Hermit, something that's made of clays and silts, is when it's first deposited, it's going to be very high percentage water. And it takes a long time, because the particles are so small, it takes a long time to squeeze out that water and get it to the stage where it can be at a point where it starts to lithify. And so the Hermit is made of it's mostly silt and clay. There's a little bit of sand in there. So it's a mudstone. The Hermit's not, during the global flood, it's not going to be able to squeeze out that water in a few hours. It's going to be kind of this amorphous sort of surface, or I mean, gel or something of silt and clay, and you're not going to be able to set down coconino sands on top of it and have a nice distinct boundary. You know what I'm saying? It's because it takes so long, thousands of years to compact and squeeze all that water out before you can have a nice smooth boundary. That's a huge problem for flood geology.
So what you're saying is, well, if we go back to the previous one, so you've got this layer on top, and then you've got another layer, and then you got the little injection-looking thingy. So what you're saying is that the global flood idea of this, like, essentially like almost like a goo, would you say, being shot down, like that takes more than like a short amount of time. It takes time to develop, right?
If it was a goo, you couldn't have a sharp crack. The coconino sands are bigger particles than what's in the Hermit. They would just intermix between the two. The coconino sand would come down and sit on there. You wouldn't have a defined boundary. You just have sort of smush of sand together with.
Interesting.
That's not a technical term, smush, but
yeah.
You wouldn't have a defined boundary. It can't happen.
Okay.
So you have to invoke some kind of miracle in order to squeeze the water out instantaneously from the Hermit, so that you can have a nice defined boundary. Then you got to lithify the thing so you can form cracks in it.
Yeah.
So that's just another thing, another point you can make to illustrate the implausibility of flood geology.
Okay, so just for some clarity here, so when you say the word Hermit, something we should have defined earlier,
the
word Hermit.
Yeah.
The red stuff is what they call the Hermit Formation.
Right.
Okay. All right. So so I put your explanation here into ChatGPT for you tell me if this is a good explanation. So so basically, if you imagine you have two layers of Earth, one is an old hard layer called the Hermit, so that's the below layer, and the other is made of a soft, dry sand like you have at the beach, so that's the top layer. Over time, the Hermit layer turned into solid rock, like a crusty, hard pancake. So the bottom layer it's become hard like a pancake. And then water got into the sand layer, making it wet and squishy. So you would you say that your view there is water involved?
Yes, there's water involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's water involved. So in other words, just because there's water involved doesn't necessarily mean that we should necessarily think that a global flood had to be required to do this.
Right. Water from a water table. So
yeah.
Hermit is fine particle silt and clay, and that kind of rock does not allow water to permeate very well.
Okay.
Unless it cracks in or something like that. So you're going to get a water table on top of the Hermit.
I see.
And the water does exist in deserts, like I showed in that earlier photo. It does rain in desert too. And while all this was going on, things were very close to sea level, so there was no place for really groundwater to go. It just sat there. So you had saturated sands in the bottom of the Coconino.
Interesting. Okay.
And it could be the whole Coconino was saturated.
Yeah.
It could have been underwater, which we'll get to later.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it could have been when the tor reef was getting deposited that this could have happened.
Yeah. So then, and later, and more to explain your view. So if you imagine the Earth, it started to squeeze and push these layers. The hard hermit rock started bending upward and eventually cracked. And when it cracked, the wet sand from below rushed up through the cracks like water squirting out when you squeeze a water balloon.
Right.
So the old rock layer cracked and wet sand squeezed into the cracks. Is this a good explanation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And just what'd you say?
Squeeze downward into the formation.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I was a little confused by that. So why ChatGPT said that? So the water was on top of the hard layer and it got squished into it.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that explanation. Or I guess ChatGPT to the rescue here. All right. That makes a lot more sense there. Okay. All right. So I covered that up, so I just want to make sure everyone saw that. So flood geology can't explain rapid dewatering, compaction, and lithification of hermit. So what is compaction one more time?
That's just like the grains, the little tiny silt grains and the clays. That's the space between those grains getting smaller and smaller. So the hermit would actually lose thickness as this dewatering process happens. But the way it was really deposited was gradually. The hermit was not all deposited in a few days. It happened over hundreds of thousands of years. So the lithification probably occurred in stages. Built up at the bottom of the hermit, and then as new stuff was added on top. Maybe that could have been lithified at a later time. But yeah, the deep time stuff's kind of hard to comprehend.
Yeah, and then lithification.
Turning,
what's that?
It's turning into rock. Lithification is like the process of becoming rock.
Okay, yeah. So the loose bits of dirt, sand, or mud get turned into solid rock. Okay.
Yeah.
And then compaction. Over time, layers of material pile up on top of each other. The weight from all the layers on top squishes the lower layers, pushing the grains closer together. Okay, so basically you're just saying that couldn't have happened in this situation with the global flood. I got you. Okay.
You have to get the water out of those spaces too. It's got to be able to go somewhere, and that takes a long time. That's what Scott Dunn was pointing out in the January paper.
I see. Okay.
With all clay, then it takes a really long time because clay, the pore space is so small. The particles are so small.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And just for some clarity there, so all this stuff, like you can still have a global flood, but this just be unrelated to it, right? Theoretically.
Yeah, the way I look at it, like if the flood was global, it didn't accomplish this work that we're looking at. It just covered the planet, and then I'm not saying this is my position, but
yeah,
it covered. There were features on the planet. There was the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, things like that. There was a big flood. You can argue that it covered the whole planet, but when it receded, it left things pretty much the way things were before, except maybe a little bit, some small layers of silt and stuff like that. But pretty much same figure, same planet. No plates screamed around the planet and readjusted during that flood. The landscape was the same before now.
Right. So in other words, like what you're saying right now, even if these arguments for the Coconino Sandstone are wrong, it doesn't necessarily disprove a global flood. It's just talking about a situation that just didn't have to happen to do much to do with the global flood.
It didn't rework the geologic record.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, are you good? Ready to go on to the next part?
Okay. We did part of that already. That was Dr. Brand's experiment.
Okay.
Let's see. We can probably skip down some other points. The water current was 0.2 miles per hour. Can you just get back to the other slide just for a sec?
Oh, this one?
Yeah, the last point there.
Okay.
The models that flood geologists have, like Dr. Baumgartner's global flood models that he's come out with recently, he's got flood currents in there that are like the simulated flood currents that are over the land is like 30 to 45 miles per hour. So Dr. Brand's currents were 0.2 miles per hour. That that a flow of 3 miles per hour is a pretty screaming current. I'm a scuba diver, and 3 mile an hour current is like um, pretty bad. I've been in higher currents. You just fly across the bottom like a bird or something. 45 miles an hour. Track makers aren't going to be able to make any tracks in that kind of water current.
Mm-hmm.
So the different flood geologists, they're not coordinating their proposals. I guess is my point there. And then there's another idea going around. You see it a lot in your discussions that, well, the tide just, the water just rose and fell like tides. And when it was low, that's when the animals could walk around and leave footprints. Then the water rose up again. Well, the way hydraulics works is you can't just have water that's 100 feet deep and then have it just recede down to zero in a matter of hours. Hydraulics doesn't allow that. It takes weeks or months for that to happen. Like if you had a slab of water that's like 200 miles wide and 200 feet deep, and you just like it was in a big ring, a steel ring, and you just lifted up the ring, and then if you're on that water in the center of that ring, you'd still be floating on water weeks later. It's not gonna it's not just going to go down like the tide. And it's on the seashore. That's just one place where the water is just moving up and down a slight amount, maybe like 30 feet in the Bay of Fundy, but most places 3 to 5 feet. Hydraulics doesn't allow water over a broad area to just go up and down and expose the land repeatedly. So that's the point I want to make there. And then there's a next slide there. I think you were showing for a second was some good follow-up. Well, that's a slab of the Coconino in that Alf Museum in California. And you can see there that some of the tracks go nice and straight. Some of them are pretty zigzaggy, and some of them are pretty small. And they go all over the place. And there's nice little ridges that haven't been destroyed by water. And the animals don't look like they were in any big hurry to escape rising floodwaters or anything like that. So that's the point I'd make about that picture there. And then there's also the problem. There's a paper that came out in the CMI website recently about there's a problem with the way footprints get more and more common as you get up and higher in the geologic record. And they're more abundant in the late flood layers than they are in early flood layers. And they should have been wiped out. All the animals should have been wiped out by day 150. So they're saying there's a problem there that needs to be resolved. So even the flood geologists, some of them are acknowledging that the trackways are a problem. So, and Dr. Brand recently in a book, he said that the ultimate conclusion at present it's not clear what the ultimate conclusion from this research will be. So even he is saying that it's not conclusive that the footprints were made underwater. And then the last point that I make is you have some wind ripple surfaces where the ripple index has been applied, where you can apply the ripple index. They got trackways on them, so you got tracks on surfaces with wind ripples. They're not water ripples. They're not the low index water ripples. They're high index wind ripples. So
okay. And so just for the audience then, so if you remember the discussion, so you see all these like footprints, and there's some footprints that look like the animal might have been like pulled by like water or something like that. So the discussion is like, how could these have formed? So you have some that are like pointed sideways, which suggests that the fossilized tracks might have been made by underwater. However, other scientists who studied the tracks noticed that the tracks pointed uphill, even when the animals were moving sideways across the sand. So what you're trying to say is that doesn't necessarily mean that that points to a global flood, and that there's even issues with these views,
Yeah.
as some young Earth creations are admitting.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's see here. I'm trying to make sure I have everything. What'd you say?
A lizard's been observed going scampering sideways, and the feet were pointed in a more uphill direction. So um, they on a modern land dune,
Yeah,
lizards were spotted doing what you see in that Coconino slab.
yeah,
And you
yeah.
can also look at that really close. I read a paper about this where, you can see the left-hand footprints of the animal were uh, obviously showing that the animal was trying to shore itself up as it was walking sideways. And so the right-hand footprints are small, and the bottom left-hand ones that were lower on the slope, they're deeper, and see the animal trying to right itself as it was going sideways.
Yeah. So and just to maybe try and explain this one. So in this, if the explanation for this is a global flood, you have to deal with, like, okay, so the water first coming on the planet, and then the water receding because it took a long time period, as the biblical text, according to young Earth creationists, seems to imply. And so, like, the problem here is that as you move higher in the rock layer, so like you have different levels of rocks, as you get higher, they're more diverse and numerous, what they call track waves. So if the problem is that if it's a global flood, well, then it would have wiped out all the animals.
Yeah.
But as these layers are going up each year, as time goes on, they're going to keep going extra layers of sand or whatever, of dirt. So if you want to say, hey, like, all these steps, like, it started at the bottom, like, okay, that might make sense with the water coming down onto the animals when they're alive. But after day 150, there's no way that all the animals are going to be alive. So
Yeah.
that wouldn't make sense with uh, more steps going into the higher levels.
Yeah. Yeah. And their trackways are at hundreds or even thousands of different levels in the record in the Colorado Plateau.
Huh.
It's not just, like you said, it's not just at the bottom. And then you look at some of those layers up higher where the dinosaurs are running, or walking, I should say. That I've heard it argued that, well, they were marching to escape the global flood coming. Well, there's a place where they found some trackways going one way, and then just to the left of them, there was trackways going the other. So the dinosaurs were going the opposite way. So which dinosaurs were escaping the flood? They were just doing their thing, looking around for food.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Was there anything else you want to mention here?
Just a quick one. That's in Duché sandstone, which is a kind of equivalent to the early Coconino. And the scientists found, like, all these levels of trackways just in the crossbeds. So you can see the beds there, and then a little track symbol on top. And all those beds had trackways in them. So that doesn't sync with a global flood either. That's another example of how you had a bed deposited, the animal walked on it. Sometime later, another crossbed was deposited on top of it, and animal walked on that bed. And then later on, another crossbed was deposited, and it just went on for dozens of times.
Huh.
That's my point there. And that's my footprint along the Colorado River.
Oh, wow.
And the little waves come up. One wave comes up and it's gone. So how are you gonna? The global flood it doesn't make sense from that standpoint either. It's just not gonna. The footprint's not gonna survive water going over it.
Okay.
That's it. Raindrop imprints. Okay, I try to make this quick. We're taking too much time here, I think. The flood geologists look at this and say that raindrops form a mottled surface on substrates rather than distinct craters like you have in the Coconino. And another argument they say is the raindrops typically occur in linear zones, not randomly scattered. And the third argument they use to argue that these aren't raindrop imprints is that some depressions are really burrows from animals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The deepness and spacing of the depressions is going to depend on the kind of rain that's falling. I lived in the desert for a long time. I went to graduate school in Tucson. Sometimes you get these rainstorms that are like spatters of rain. They just like for a brief minute, you get some big raindrops that fall and just kind of leave. They would leave kind of a spotty pattern on sand. If you have hard rain, yeah, that's different. But in the desert, a lot of the rains are real sporadic. So the reason they're in rows is it goes back to the wind ripple thing. The raindrops fell on a wind rippled surface sometimes, and then later on, the raindrops the imprints that were on the top of the ripples got slightly blown away or eroded away. So only the dry imprints in the depression are the ones that survive. So that's why they look like they're in rows. Excuse me. And then burrows, yeah, there's lots of burrows in the Coconino. They're finding them all over the place, and that indicates animals living in a stable environment. Not the kind of thing we're talking about with the flood geology, where you have to have 75 on the order of 75 feet of sediment piling up each day to deposit the Colorado Plateau in a year. You can't you can't have animals showing nice traces in burrows if the sand's piling up at that kind of rate. So that's my pretty much my answer to that charge that the raindrop imprints aren't really raindrop imprints.
So just for clarity, so it seems to me that there's water involved on both views. So why would this be evidence for a global flood?
It's not. Yeah, that's a good question. How is this evidence for a global flood? Well, basically, Dr. Whitmore says he's still thinking about this. He's still studying. He doesn't know what the cause is for these things. Now, some have proposed, like Dr. Brand came out with a paper where he said some of these craters are like gas escape from below. That could be the reason for some of them. For a few, I would say, not very many, but again, you have this distinction between water, presence of water, and the flood geology requirement, which is being underwater hundreds of feet and having pretty darn near 100 feet of sediment having to pile up every day.
So are you saying that if these are raindrop imprints, then would that be evidence against Whitmore's position of a global flood?
Yeah, because then you have rain falling on a layer that's deposited pretty much near the middle of the global flood.
Oh, okay.
Water at that time, you can't have rain hitting sand surface then.
So, like, you're talking about like what day, hypothetically, like day 100 of the flood. Like, if there's a bunch of water there, you're not going to see water hitting the surface if there's a bunch of water there already.
I had it figured out, like under Steve Austin's scenario. I'm trying to remember where I had the Coconino. You got about 3,000 feet of layers underneath there.
It doesn't have to be exact for the example, but is that the principle?
Somewhere less than day 100, I think, is when the Coconino.
Day 100, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that exactly, but it's right around there.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And anything here that you wanted to mention?
Okay, just the just a photo of raindrop imprints on the left side there. The right one is some burrows that were found in the Coconino. So the Park Service geologists are aware of that. They've got samples. They just showed animals living around in a nice stable environment where they could dig burrows and do their thing, hunt for whatever it was they eat.
So that's like almost like a hole that an animal burrowed in there, and what did it get cracked? Is that why it has those weird shapes?
Yeah, it's burrowing sideways. That would be like looking down, I think, at a slab of or a little piece of Coconino, and you're looking at the burrows going in a side direction.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Middle one's just one of Dr. Whitmore's photos.
Yeah. All right. Number 7.
Yeah. The argument there was this one probably mystified me the longest. I didn't understand what was going on here or probably going on. the large contorted beds in the Coconino, like those that we see in Lizard Head, which is right above above Sedona, Arizona, they can only be formed in strong water currents. And the flood geology view is something like when you're making an omelet, and you get the one side nice and firm, and you get the cheese in there and whatever it was you're going to add, all your peppers, and then you take a spatula and you like flip over half of it, and that's kind of what they're arguing here. Like water currents kind of acted like a spatula, and lifted up huge areas of sediment, just flipped it over. If I'm understanding them right, that's what they're saying. But if you look at it up close, there's a guy named Gerald Bryant that studied a lot of soft sediment deformation in the Helble sandstone, which is a younger one up north in Utah. He went down and looked at this thing. He said there's 3 sets of crossbeds here, and the deformation is really internal just to the middle crossbed.
Before you get into that, just for clarity there, so you'll see on the picture, like there's this weird like little shape here. It's like, how did that happen? And I guess the flood position would be that, hey, that's only could have happened by water, and that you have this, I guess, sand that was underwater, and it got flipped over. So that's why it made like a weird sideways U-shaped.
Yeah.
And then they're basically like, hey, I watched this just earlier. Like they're like, the only way this can happen is if it's underwater. So why do you not think that's the case? Go ahead and keep going.
Yeah. Well, water was involved, and it was sort of. It's not underwater necessarily, but if it is underwater, it's very shallow water. But the deformation was internal to just one of the crossbed sets there. And that you can see I have a big bracket there that labels the middle crossbed set. And deformation is in the middle of that. And the better explanation that Dr. Bryant gave was it's hard to picture in this from that photograph.
Yeah.
This happens in that area of the Coconino that's like at the south end of that peninsula that I showed you early on. And it's right near the ocean on the south side, the south boundary of the Coconino. And again, this is all happening. Coconino is all being deposited when it's very close to sea level. And what happened was one of these mega dunes collapsed into a zone of saturated sand. The sand was already, water's involved, but this giant mega dune, something happened to undermine it, and it was already inherently unstable to start with because of the way the beds were and stuff in that setting. Something happened to undermine the base of this thing, and the whole thing just came down and went whop on the on the ground. It's sort of like a shock wave went through the sand and formed these things. That's kind of my layman interpretation of what Dr. Bryant was saying. So it's the scale is big. It's hundreds of feet. So you're talking about a big event. And my little hydrologist theory, or hypothesis, I should say, is that this was in the southern part of the Coconino. It's near sea level. Its latitude is like 6 degrees north of the equator. There was a tropical storm or a hurricane caused a storm surge, probably a really good one. And in these dunes that were in that region, the water rose up and started surrounding, filling in the low spots in these dunes. This is just me. Nobody's proposed this. But then the presence of that water, it's like at a beach when you're doing a sandcastle, a wave comes up, just undermines the whole thing, and it just falls down. So, or it could have been a super heavy rain. They do have heavy rains in deserts. I can testify to that myself. But there was one in Baja California a couple years ago, 25 inches of rain from a hurricane, and that's pretty much that's way more than their annual average. But so water in the desert does happen. That there's a number of ways that could have occurred.
Mm. Okay. All right. And so I'll just the ChatGPT version here. You tell me if this is right. So some people think these twisted, messed up layers of rock were made by strong water currents pushing the sand around. But another explanation could be that part of the sandy ground got really, really wet and soft, and then it just collapsed, just like like a sandcastle when water hits it. So the wet sand couldn't hold up the layers on top, so they sank and they got all twisted. Is that a good way
Yeah,
to say it?
something like that. Yeah. So when this happened, the force of the event of the collapse caused the sand to just lose the saturated sand. It caused it to lose its internal properties. It just became called liquefied sand, and liquefaction occurred where the pulse caused this kind of contortion in the crossbeds. So
I see. Okay.
yeah, the physics is weird for liquefaction. It's just like uh, the pores, the sand grains aren't supporting each other all of a sudden. They just behave like a liquid.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What does this add to the
Yeah,
conversation?
here's what Dr. Bryant hiked up there. This is underneath Lizard Head, so this is that lower crossbed set, one that wasn't deformed. There's wind ripples there. He looked up at it and he goes, "Wait a minute!" And you can see there's multiple sheets on there, and each one of those is a little laminate that was formed when the sand was blowing across a fairly level surface and just accumulating layers as wind ripple lamina. And you can see there's a bunch of layers like that. And what he did, I think, is he picked up one of these sheets or a piece of rock that fell down below, and he measured the ripple index on it, and he got the width of the ripples were about 150 millimeters, and the height was about 50. No, the height was about 3. I'm sorry. Oh, that's a bad mistake. And the ripple index was 50, which puts it solidly in the wind ripple category.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
so you have this pre-existing bed that was formed by wind, and then above there, above that picture, that's where the soft sediment deformation. Well, that's where the contorted beds are. So
Okay.
that's just indicating that the deformation happened in beds that were formed through alien processes.
Okay. Ready to go to the next one?
Okay.
Right, the mica.
Yeah, that's another one that's a good one. There's a critic, Young and Steerley, in their book suggested that Coconino doesn't have any mica, that it was wafted away by the wind. And so the flood geologists looked at their thin sections, they saw mica in there. And then one of the students of Dr. Whitmore said, "Hey, I'll conduct an experiment to see how long mica lasts in a simulated aeolian environment." So he put a little bit of mica-rich sand in a pickle jar and then ran a propeller inside. And he set the speed so the sand would just kind of migrate around in a circle around the bottom. He said, so after 4 days, in the paper they wrote, they said that all the mica that was abraded down to the size between 0.2 and 0.5 millimeters. And then after 20 days, it was abraded in size down to somewhere between 0.12 and 0.2 millimeters. So it got smaller in time. And then at the end, the only mica they could find, and you can see there's not much sand in that jar, but the only mica they could find at that time was like trapped in little cracks in sand grains. But after 4 days, it was in their paper that they published in Aeolian Research, and that paper is, you can't just look at it online. You have to pay $35 or something like that to look at it. It's one of those paywall things. They report that it's 0.2 to 0.5 millimeters. So anyway, go to the next slide and you'll see some more info here that's interesting.
Okay, so just for some clarity there, so they're doing this experiment and they're like, hey, this thing called mica, it is in the Coconino, but when you look at the desert, they're saying, hey, it's not in the typical desert sand. So obviously, if it was just like a typical desert, then we wouldn't expect to find mica. So the better explanation is it must have been from water, because water, and then this experiment, as we'll see, water doesn't destroy this mica. So
Yeah.
its better explanation is that the Coconino came from some type of water, like a flood.
Yeah, you got it pretty much right. Except mica does exist in some desert sands, and they point out that it's when the sand is close to a source area. That's probably a good explanation for a lot of it. But it also it's listed as a constituent of aeolian dunes in a in the defining book on sand dunes by Pai and Soar. It's listed as a constituent of sand dunes, so it's not like it doesn't occur. It's just there's places, there's a lot of dunes where you don't see it, and there's a reason for that. We'll get to that in a second, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, so they did the second experiment. They put mica in water, they tumbled it, and not much happened to it after a year. So here's where it gets interesting. In the Aeolian research, they pointed out that the mica after 4 days was 0.2 to 0.5 millimeters. But when Dr. Whitmore's talking at a creation conference or writing an article for Answers in Genesis, or something like that, he says that mica disappears in 2 to 4 days. Sometimes he says 2, sometimes he says 4. But reducing them down to 0.5 to 0.2 millimeters is not the same as disappearing. So that's a really interesting thing. Then it gets more interesting because when you look at their thin section photos, they show mica between about 0.1 to 0.3 millimeters, with one that's like, I measured using their scale, is like 0.43. So it's a little over 0.4 millimeters. So so the mica from the first pickle jar experiment is the same size as mica that they found in the Coconino. It didn't disappear. If it disappeared, then you wouldn't see it in the Coconino. I mean, what they're saying doesn't make sense. It's the same. The stuff from their experiment after 2 to 4 days is the same size as mica that you find in the Coconino.
And this is under the wind sand idea, not the water. So So under this experiment where they applied the wind to the sand, what you're saying is it looks like the Coconino.
Yeah, and that graph is one from that research paper in Aeolian research, and a little bar there's a 96 down there, kind of near the bottom. That's 96 hours after the start of the experiment. Mica flakes after 4 days in the pickle jar is 0.2 to 0.5 millimeters. So you can see how it starts off big at the top, and then the flakes are big, and then as the propeller is turned on and it blows the sand around the bottom of the jar, then it gets smaller in time. So you can see, like after 480 hours, it's not a linear scale, that the mica's down there at that 0.12 to 0.12 to 0.2 range. So that's a reasonable experiment. You know, you blow it longer around with sand in a jar, it's going to get smaller.
Yeah.
But it's the same size after 96 hours. It's the same size as the stuff in the Coconino. So there's just a couple of their slides, their thin sections, to give you an idea of what they're saying. And you can see the left-hand one, there's a mica flake that's like 0.14 millimeters. And then the biggest one, the best one they have is, that's the one I said is about 0.43 millimeters on the right. And guess which one they always show in the creation conferences? They always show the big one, that one on the right. Because the idea is big flakes can't exist in an Aeolian environment.
So what was, as far as the sizes go, were most of them 403? What is that, or whatever that means?
430. Most of them were like 0.1 millimeters to 0.3 millimeters. The 0.43 is the biggest one they have that I've seen in pictures in their articles.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So what they've never considered was what's shown in this picture here. It's going on right now. The winds in the Sahara blowing dust out into the Atlantic Ocean. It's suppressing hurricanes. That's why we're not getting hurricanes right now from they usually form after at this time off the African coast. This rust interferes with it. But there's been some interesting papers that I found online where, like at the Cabo Verde Islands, they measured mica flakes that blew from the Sahara that were 0.35 millimeters. They blew at least 570 miles, probably further, because the Sahara, that's just the coastline distance. And then there's a guy that put these traps in the ocean waters all the way across the Atlantic to South America, and he found mica in those traps that was blown in these dust plumes high in the atmosphere over 2,000 miles. So remember at the start, I was talking about the Western Interior Desert and the monsoon winds blowing from the inland areas. In that time frame, you could easily have mica being lofted high in the atmosphere and then blown into the area where the Coconino is, and it settles down at points in time when the winds allow it. And then it gets buried by sand, and it doesn't even have time to get blown around much. It just got buried. And we know there's clay in the Coconino. There's places where they found where a new place. I could get into that later, where there was looks like there was a oases with water and clay a few millimeters thick formed on the bottom of this thing. So the smaller clay particles formed little clay drapes and stuff in the Coconino.
Okay, so what you're saying is like, hey, the global flood person is like, hey, the Coconino can't have this big sizes of mica if it is from a sand dune. It has to be formed by water. That's the only thing that makes sense for these mica to not be destroyed. But what you're saying is, one, like the sizes that we see are what we would expect, but also two, there's other ways that we can get big mica to be there, and even though it still be like a Saharan desert.
Yeah, but this particular place, the winds are blowing it straight westward. In the Coconino time, you had the winds blowing from that that area where it had these huge rivers dropping their sediment loads, and then huge amounts of sediments. We're talking many thousands of feet thick. And when rivers drop their sediment and the water dries up, you got all of this exposed mica just sitting there in the ground, and the wind can easily pick it up. And then lift it high in the atmosphere.
Okay, yeah. All right. And what else do we have here? Number 9. Almost done here, guys.
Yeah, we're getting almost done. Dolomite. We're trying to go fast here. Now, remember that map I showed you at the beginning with the Coconino surrounded on 3 sides. So the place, they found dolomite, marine minerals, ooids, and angular feldspar in the Coconino. So that proves that the Coconino was a marine deposit. So the thing to remember here is the Coconino, any formation name is given to a certain slice in the geologic record, but they don't have perfect edges. They're not like all monolithic. Just because the Coconino is sandstone doesn't mean it's all sand. That's the name they give it because it's dominantly sandstone, but there's other things in it. Limestone is not 100% lime. There's some sand in the limestone. So dolomite interfingers with the Coconino because it was surrounded by the sea. And if you look at the place where they found it, I have a little map there on the right. They found it at Andros Point. You look at the map, that's right where the shoreline is. So that's where you'd expect to find dolomite. And just as an aside, dolomite takes a heck of a long time to form. Geologic time, the way the magnesium minerals are oriented in dolomite, you can't just rapidly form dolomite. It's a very slow process. So the other thing to keep in mind is after the Coconino was formed, that there was a sea level change, and there's probably some subsidence going on at the same time. The sea advanced, it covered over the Coconino, and that's when the Torrey Formation was formed. But as these waters advance over the Coconino, you're going to have things like ooids and stuff like that in places, because that's what happens where you have a shoreline. You get ooids forming and getting, and some of them get deposited in the sand. So it shouldn't. It's not a surprise that you have those kind of things in there. And also, there are places in the world where carbonate grains do blow some pretty surprisingly long distances through the air, or somehow they survive hundreds of miles to transport. So I just thought I'd throw that in. So I think that covered that slide pretty well.
Yeah.
And I pretty much covered this already. Oh, the potassium feldspar. They say, the geologists say, well, how could you have these angular feldspars in the Coconino? You have to have a nearby source area for that to occur. Well, the ancestral Rockies were right there, so that's your nearby source area. That's my answer to that one. They never consider that. They just make the statement, which scores points with their target audience, but then they never really go into investigate. Well, what are the possible sources for the K feldspar? That's we can skip to the next slide.
All right.
Help finish things up fast. Frosting of the Coconino wasn't caused by ballistic collisions. Yeah, that's correct. Some critics made a statement that the frosting was caused by collisions, but they weren't really Coconino Sandstone researchers. They were people writing for popular science literature kind of purposes. So the flood geologist said this is not correct. The frosting on the Coconino was caused through chemical processes, but then it turns out, like Cunin and Purdock said, that most frosting is caused by chemical action. We know that that's how it happens. And there's a guy named Robert Folk, looking at the Simpson Desert in Australia. I'm sorry, Australia. And he said the silica is precipitated as scabby turtle skin crusts on sand grains deep in a sand dune. And this water is precipitated, water evaporates, and more crust forms. So it's a known sand dune process for chemical frosting to occur. So flood geology, they refuted the critics that said it was caused by ballistic collisions of grains, but they didn't really advance the science by what they did.
So what you're saying is these ballistic collisions that the flood geologists were correct, but we still have these things in desert areas. So does it really help the argument either way?
Does not help the argument either way. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. They say the modern sand dunes aren't as thick as the Coconino, and the Coconino couldn't have been deposited in a slowly subsiding basin because it crosses through many ancient basins. So if you look at a map, where you look at the survey, when they plot the survey data out, and they look at the depths that you have to go to reach each formation, you can see that the Coconino does fill a basin. You can pretty clearly see it in that diagram that goes from the Virgin Mountains, which are kind of like in the southwest Utah, the corner, going all the way to Mogollon Rim, which is beyond Sedona. So that's a pretty good distance, a couple hundred miles. The Coconino is filling a basin. So they assume that the processes that would slowly form a basin, crust, the deformation, could not occur. They just automatically rule it out. So they're correct. Yeah, modern sand dunes aren't that thick, but they're not looking. They're assuming that the processes that would form a basin that would provide accommodation space for sands to accumulate, they're assuming that couldn't occur. So we'll look at the plot. It shows that it does fill a basin. So that's about all I can say about that.
So just to make it more clear, so you said that it does fill the basin. So the Coconino Sandstone. So it seems to me that both views say that they can form like a basin, but there's the flood geologist is saying it can't do that gradually, like for a long time period. It would have to be something that's short. So
they're assuming it couldn't happen gradually. Yeah.
So they assume that, but do we have examples today of it being formed gradually, or what is your explanation for how it would have formed gradually?
We were talking you're talking about the times you're talking about to deform and cause a basin are like on the tens of thousands or greater years. So we just haven't had time enough to observe that kind of thing. It could be forming somewhere right now. I guess that's my answer. And it's the crust is Earth's crust is always pushing and pulling against each other in different ways. There's stresses that are being put on it that we don't even know about. Like we had an earthquake here in the East Coast. Well, you're in the East Coast, right? North Carolina.
Yep.
Yeah, we had that
Virginia.
earthquake a couple of years ago, Virginia. Pretty significant earthquake, like a 5.8. You know, there was an old fault somewhere down there that was subjected to very gradual pressures, and at some point, something down there just gave, and it was a pretty good earthquake. It wasn't as good as the ones I've been through in California, but it was pretty significant, right?
Yep.
So that kind of stuff over very long periods of geologic time can happen.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is, like, we have good reason to think that this happens. It's just like we can't see it like explicitly, like right now in most deserts, because that's something that just happens over long periods of time. So we wouldn't expect to see it specifically happening in that and like if you just look at a normal desert.
People want us to be able to observe it happening fast. Well, that's just not the way it happened, you know.
Yeah.
And by the way, look at how there's that rise in layers on the left side of that plot. You know, in the Hermit there was you can see how it was subjected to some upward forces, which goes back to that crack formation thing that we talked about previous. You know,
right.
So some deformation was going on to form that arch there. They call it the Sedona Arch.
Okay. Ready for next one?
Yeah. Sandways, last one. They say large sandways comparable to those in the Coconino have been found in marine settings. And what they say is the Coconino was deposited by sandways during the global flood in a matter of days. So there's some diagrams I got from Answers in Genesis website where they show how sandways form underwater. And they're correct. Crossbeds can form underwater. We've seen it from rivers where they leave deposits. But they don't really reveal that if you had those kind of normal sand wave processes going on, it would take hundreds of years to form the Coconino, and that's like in ideal conditions where you have like a 3 to 5 mile an hour current consistently, with endless supply of sand. You could transport enough sand to form the Coconino in 500 years or 1,000. I'm not sure exactly the number, but my calculations I got about 500. But depositing in a matter of days would require the equivalent of huge slabs of sand just like moving in to the Coconino area. You can't form sand waves when you have those kind of volumes coming in every day.
So you keep going.
That's basically what my 2011 paper was about, was that problem.
Okay. So basically what it's saying is these sand waves that we see in the Coconino, they look a lot like the way that we see the water do that. But you're saying, hey, that would take hundreds of years for the even to happen. So even if it was this idea that it was formed through water, that wouldn't point to a flood. That would point to something else. And then two. Wait, so just for clarity, so this explanation that they're giving for the crossbeds, that's you wouldn't use a water as the way this happens, right?
For Coconino, no. I would say wind is responsible. Now, if you have a place where the Coconino was getting reworked when this what we call the Torweep Sea was advancing across the top of the Coconino, there may be some places. Some scientists, geologists were telling me that they wouldn't be surprised to find places where the Coconino was reworked by advancing sea. But that's just like in localized areas at the top.
Yeah. So this is more of just like the global flood explanation for how it could have occurred, but you're just critiquing that. Like this is just one explanation that's not necessarily evidence for the view, even if it is correct.
Now, Steve Austin came out with an explanation in 1992 or
Mm.
94 on the sand waves thing, and that's what my 2011 paper was about. And there used to be things all over the web when I first started looking at the web in the early 2000s,
Mm.
using Austin's argument to argue that the Coconino was deposited as sand waves underwater. And I don't know if there's a relationship or not, but when my paper came out in 2011, you don't see that argument being used anymore at all.
Interesting. Okay.
And Dr. Whitmore never uses it. He never cites Austin's
Oh, interesting.
procedure.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the underwater sand wave sites there. That's the Golden Gate. Let's see. What can I say really quick about that? Well, look under the Golden Gate where it's blue and purple, kind of.
Okay.
Water is screaming through there. That's why nobody escaped from Alcatraz. You know, the water just tidal exchange 5, 6, even more miles per hour. There's no sand waves at all. It's too fast. So it slows down a little bit. It forms sand waves further out into the ocean. The
wow.
right-hand side is another shot looking down. It's all compiled data from surface radar. And then the bottom right is a profile that was in a paper that I looked at. And so I just estimated, I did the slopes on those sand waves, and I got, you can see the numbers there. So I should have used a better font size. 15 degrees, 16 degrees, there's another 15, 17 degrees. All those are less than 20. I just thought that was interesting that the site they were citing there is all kind of moderate angle crossbeds.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So
what do we have here?
The Coconino getting deposited in this estimate 10 days. You have like some source area north, and then you have the south part. That's where it ended up. 10 days, you move 10,000 cubic miles of sand. That's why I say the crossbeds could have been formed in this kind of situation. So anyway, keep going. This is what you got to think about a bigger scale, Colorado Plateau. I compiled a bunch of data for how deep the strata are in the plateau. I got an average of 3.2 miles, and the surface area of the plateau is 150,000 square miles, so it's about 390 miles on a side. You got to fill that box, 3.2 miles by 390 by 390, in less than a year. So to do that, I calculated you have to do about 75 feet per day to fill that box with sand, and then somehow you got to keep the different kinds I illustrate there from mixing together too, which is another issue that you got to deal with.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that you have to make it so that each different layer is not mixed together.
Yeah, you got to make but just the volume you have to move from one spot to another is staggering. 75 feet per day. And if you look at the next slide after that, I thought, how can I illustrate that? And everybody likes football, right? So I showed illustrated a slab of sand, 75 feet high and 390 miles wide, which is 12,875 football fields wide. And that would be covered. This rate would have to go on for the entire deposition phase of the global flood. You'd have to cover up that many football fields in 16 seconds.
Okay, but if I'm a global flood advocate, I'm thinking, well, obviously the global flood was really big. There was all kinds of water. It could have pushed everything, all kinds of different geological processes going on. So why would that be a problem there?
You still got to move that much sand. They never seem to want to be able to comprehend that you're talking about moving that much sand. And once I've had some conversations where I think I finally got the person to realize how much volume you're talking about, how much sand has to advance across the Colorado Plateau every day, then they just kind of disappear from the conversation. They never.
So you're saying that like how long are we talking? Like how many days?
Well, I used the 224 days that Henry Morris had in Genesis flood, which came from the Bible. Some flood geologists, like Tim Clary, allow even less time.
So you're saying like 16 seconds for every 16 seconds, there's a whole new layer of sand put on there for 200 or so days.
Yeah, 224 days. every 16 seconds, you got to cover 12,875 football fields worth of land to deposit the Colorado Plateau, and that's with a 16 miles per hour advancing slab. And I just threw in that little picture of Bo Jackson when he did that famous run into the tunnel at the LA Coliseum. That's about as fast as he was running when he scored that touchdown. But just to inject a little humor there. Now there's places where sediment's even thicker than that. So I mean, the slabs would have to be even thicker to do the work. And the bigger you make the area that you're trying to fill with sand, the worse the problem gets. So if you make like the whole western U.S., if you're trying to fill that with sand from somewhere else, then the slab has to be even higher each day. And if you want to make it small slabs, you say, well, let's just make 1 foot sand slabs coming in. So if you have one coming in and it covers the plateau, and another one comes in and covers the plateau, they would have to each slab would have to move at about Mach 1.4, I think, or was it Mach 1.6 that I calculated, more than the speed of sound.
Oh, okay. That's that would be a problem.
Yeah, that's a problem there. So okay, we can move on to whatever I have next here. This was just to illustrate the detail in the record. You're trying to produce the kind of detail on the right, and this just happened to be 75 feet thick. This cross section of sandstone and limestone and mudstone, shale, at a site in St. George, Utah, called the Dinosaur Discovery Site. You can visit the thing. It's supposed to be really interesting. I was going to go there, but then the pandemic happened. So future, we'll do it. But look at all the stuff you have in there. You got all these layers of mud cracks. You got layers with footprints. That's what the orange footprint symbol is. You got some dinosaur fossils in there. You got a layer up there near the top with a thing called a stromatolite, which is an algae colony thing. And all this would have to form in 1 day. And that's just a little slice of the part of the Colorado Plateau.
Yeah. So why would this be a problem of filling in for 1 day?
Too much detail, too many events, and not enough time. There's a geologist that you see a lot on Facebook, Kevin Nelstead, points that out. You have way astronomically too many events to happen in one time, and for this to happen.
Yeah. So I'm seeing like 30 layers of dirt here basically, and each layer of dirt's got a certain amount of animals in it. So you're saying that it had to be like bop, 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 like each layer in 1 day is what you're saying.
Yeah. If it came down from above, like if it rained down from space, which I don't think anybody really argues. Well, maybe Brown does, but this stuff, you have this huge, like I showed in the previous graphic, was the equivalent of a slab of sand 75 feet high. And that's assuming instant compaction, which is not realistic. You got all this stuff happening in 1 day at this site. And how is that going to happen? You got to think about how would that happen with an advancing slab of sand that's sweeping across the region at 16 miles per hour.
Well, I'll tell you what, I would not survive that.
Yeah. Well, Bo Jackson would not survive it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's my final summary here. Just, the alien deposition of the Coconino is indicated by the presence of wind ripples, even in places like that site above Sedona, Lizard Head, even in places where they tried to argue for aqueous deposition. The presence of animal footprints at multiple levels, even in the Coconino, there's many levels, dozens of levels with footprints. The sharp boundary between the Coconino and the Hermit, the Coconino sandstone just meshed with the Hermit when they were deposited. So that argues for alien deposition. And then just the astronomical deposition rate that would be required to deposit the Coconino in a matter of days. So that's kind of my summary of why the Coconino was an alien deposit.
I see. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. Anything else here?
No, we can skip that one now. The
Okay.
last one's kind of cool. There's a really excellent presentation by this guy named Dr. Rickey Bartlett
Uh-huh.
on the riddle of Arizona's Coconino Sandstone. And I provide a link there, but if you just Google Rickey Bartlett, Coconino Sandstone,
It's in the
you'll
description.
probably find it. So I really recommend watching that video. It's like 43 minutes long, and he's doing current research on the Coconino, and he shows how it's done. You know, he's going in there with sort of you know, he's curious. He's looked at some of the stuff Whitmore has done. He doesn't have a bias one way or the other, and he's just calls it like it is.
Oh, interesting. So
Yeah,
he's working with Whitmore's data. That's
he's
really
not working
cool.
with his daughter. He's aware of Whitmore. In fact,
Okay.
that graphic you showed me, the Coconino,
Yeah.
he got that from Whitmore's presentation, so I know he's
Oh,
seen it.
cool.
Yeah, and the fact that he uses it in that presentation that I just recommended, that shows that he's looked at least one of Whitmore's papers.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. Awesome. All right. Yeah. So people
Oh,
should
yeah,
definitely check it out.
yeah,
A lot of fun stuff there. But yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on here. Thank you so much, Tim. And people should check out the links in the description. We'll have the articles on there, and you can check out another book that he wrote with uh, shoot, was it Kara Hill and Greg Davidson? Carol Hill be on the channel soon, most likely. Greg Davidson's been on the channel before. But
okay.
yeah, anything last words? Any last things you want to say before we get going here?
No, I just would say it's we just have to consider the option that God operated over long periods of time, and not let that destroy our faith. You know, we have to find
Hmm.
a way to live with the uncertainty that comes with this kind of thing. God still exists. Jesus is still on the throne, and you know, don't be afraid of new information like this coming out.
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as flood videos, so I just had an interview with Dr. Andrew Loke. We briefly talked about his idea for a global flood and how that would, or sorry, a local flood and how that would work with what we see from science in the Bible. I've interviewed Tripper Longman on the topic, and there'll be more on the topic if you want to learn more about biblical views for how you can understand the biblical text with what we see from science. But
Yeah.
all right, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Uh,
Make sure to like and subscribe, everybody. And otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your day.